The three early immigration acts in United States history were the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Barred Zone Act of 1917, and the Immigration Act of 1924. These acts were originally established to prevent too many people from entering the U.S., but it eventually got out of hand. The government was supposed to be responsible enough to control the acts, but instead they abused their power by excluding Asians and discriminating against them, showing a clear violation of their rights by denying them entry.
John Sutter, a German-born Swiss pioneer, settler, and colonizer, was having a water-powered sawmill built along the American River in Coloma, California in 1848. On January 24, his carpenter, James W. Marshall, found flakes of gold in a stream bed. News of the gold soon spread, and they were overrun by thousands of fortune seekers. By August of 1848, about 4,000 gold seekers were in the area, and in the next year the number rose to about 80,000. The gold seekers were called the 49ers. Word of a mountain of gold across the ocean had traveled to Hong Kong in 1849, and it quickly spread across other Chinese provinces. And by 1851, about 25,000 Chinese immigrants had left their homes and moved to California, which some called Gamstan, or Gold Mountain. At first, they came to work in the gold mines, but soon they began to take agricultural jobs and factory work, especially in the garment industry. Chinese immigrants were also particularly helpful in the construction of railroads in the American West, and as Chinese laborers grew successful in the United States, some of them also became entrepreneurs. The anti-Chinese sentiment from workers in the American economy increased, resulting in a legislation that aimed to limit future Chinese immigration and threatened to worsen diplomatic relations between the United States and China. American objections toward Chinese immigration mostly stem from economic and cultural tensions, as well as ethnic discrimination. The Chinese immigrants faced heavy financial pressures, which left them little choice but to work for whatever wages they could. And many non-Chinese workers came to hate Chinese workers because they believed that the Chinese immigrants might take all the jobs. To address these social tensions, the California state government passed many measures aimed at Chinese residents, which required special licenses for Chinese businesses or workers to prevent naturalization. But since the anti-Chinese discrimination and the efforts to stop Chinese immigration violated the 1868 Burlingame Sewer Treaty with China, the federal government was able to nullify much of this legislation. Democrats, led by supporters in the West, advocated for all-out exclusion of Chinese immigrants, and although Republicans were largely sympathetic to Western concerns, they were committed to a platform of free immigration. In order to calm the Western states without offending China, President Hayes sought a revision of the Burlingame Sewer Treaty in which China agreed to limit immigration to the United States. In 1880, the Hayes administration appointed a U.S. diplomat, James B. Angell, to negotiate a new treaty with China, and the resulting Angell Treaty allowed the U.S. to restrict but not completely ban Chinese immigration. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which suspended the immigration of Chinese laborers for a period of 10 years. The act also made it mandatory for every Chinese person traveling in or out of the country to carry a certificate showing their status as a laborer, scholar, diplomat, or merchant. The 1882 Act was the first in American history to place broad restrictions on immigration and to target a particular ethnicity.
The Immigration Act of 1917, better known as the Barred Zone Act of 1917, created a barred zone extending from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, from which no people were allowed to enter the U.S. However, the Act's main restriction consisted of a literacy test intended to reduce European immigration. It had taken Congress nearly 2 decades to enact the literacy test, after repeated vetoes from the White House. Congress was successful because of heightened fears of immigration and the spread of radicalism due to World War I and the Russian Revolution. The Barred Zone Act aimed to exclude so-called undesirables, which included the insane, diseased, poor, or physically disabled, anarchists, prostitutes, or other groups deemed unworthy for entrance. Since previous legislation had already restricted immigration from China and Japan, the new act effectively focused on South Asian immigrants, primarily from India. Prejudice toward Asian immigrants was rooted in stereotypical conceptions of Asian people and anxieties that the foreign cultures would start replacing American culture. This ideology was reflected in other laws of the time, which further tightened immigration. President Woodrow Wilson initially vetoed the 1917 Act, for he felt that the introduction of a literacy requirement prevented the uneducated from receiving equal opportunities. Wilson's veto of the act was overridden by Congress, though, and the act became law on February 5, 1917. The Immigration Act illustrated the resurgence of nativism in the country, putting extensive restrictions on immigration in order to protect American culture from ethnic invasion. The long-term implications persisted for decades. Asian immigrants were not granted the right to naturalization until new legislation was passed in the 1940s and 1950s, and until the Immigration Act of 1990, language barring homosexual immigrants remained in the Immigration Code.
The Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, limited the number of immigrants allowed entry into the United States through a national origins quota. The quota provided immigration visas to 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in the United States as of the 1890 national census. It completely excluded immigrants from Asia. In 1917, the U.S. Congress enacted the first widely restrictive immigration law. The uncertainty generated over national security during World War I made it possible for Congress to pass this legislation, and it included several important provisions that paved the way for the 1924 Act. Faced with rapid social, economic, and demographic changes, along with increasing political anxiety, Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924 on May 26 of that year. The House passed the 1924 Immigration Act, a measure which was a legislative expression of the xenophobia, particularly towards Eastern and Southern European immigrants, that swept America in the decade of the 1920s. Authored by Representative Albert Johnson of Washington, chairman of the House Immigration Committee, the bill passed with broad support from Western and Southern representatives by a vote of 323 to 71. It has become necessary that the United States cease to become an asylum, Representative Johnson declared during debate on the bill. Among its provisions, the Act created a permanent quota system based on national origin. It limited the number of immigrants that could be admitted to the U.S. to 2% of the total number of individuals from each nationality that resided in the United States in 1890, before waves of Slavic and Italian immigrants arrived in America. Despite vigorous protests from Japanese diplomats, the measure also excluded Japanese immigrants, a ban that would not be lifted until 1952. Finally, it allowed no more than 150,000 total immigrants who fell within the parameters of the quota system to enter the U.S. in any 1 year. After Senate passage, the Immigration Act was signed into law in late May 1924.
This demonstrates the U.S. government abusing their responsibility, authority, and power by discriminating against Asians. The government denied the rights of Asians by discriminating against them based on their ethnicity and refusing them entry. The government and U.S. citizens were influenced by xenophobia, which was becoming increasingly prevalent at the time.